She's most notable for publishing a translation of this work, along with commentary in Manipravalam by Periya Vachan Pillai. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Center of Studies of Manuscript Cultures, University of Hamburg. The title of her speech is going to be Samsara Liberation, Immortality, the Āḻvārs' Quest for Divine Compassion. Dr. Ananda Kechnin, you may begin.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me. Although I must confess that I was a little surprised at being invited to talk about a theme that I do not know much about, I must confess right at the beginning. Although I did grow up in the Tamil land, so I do know of Vallalar and the Siddhas and some of their verses, but really not much. My area of specialization is rather early Bhakti poetry, especially Vaishnava Bhakti poetry. So I have adapted the topic of immortality and compassion to fit my own field. So some of the things I will say, probably the philosophy is rather different from what we've heard so far. There might be some common points as well, because I mean, the Āḻvārs and Vallalar, etc., they after all came from the same land, although there were a few centuries difference between them. So the Bhakti poets in Tamil, I'm sure you all know about them. There are the Vaishnava Āḻvārs, but also the Shaiva Nayanmas, who kickstarted the Bhakti movement between the 5th, 6th centuries and the 9th century in the Tamil land. Although, okay, I know some people don't like to use the word movement, but still, this movement actually spread to the rest of India and beyond over the centuries. So if you've heard of Surdas or Mirabai, well, somehow, somewhere, it was the Āḻvārs and the Nayamas who influenced them directly or indirectly. So I'll first begin by drawing your attention to the premises upon which the Āḻvārs stand. So the first of all, for them, the body and the soul are different. The body is perishable, while the soul is immortal. The soul acquires many bodies in many births, which are dependent on their individual karma, and the cycle of births and deaths, known as samsara, is perpetuated. So we need to know this right at the beginning. So some questions that rise here and that I will seek to answer in this talk are, what do the Āḻvārs think of the physical body? Because if you're going to speak of biological immortality, we need to speak about the body. So what do the Āḻvārs think of the physical body? What about the soul? What do they think of the soul? How do they perceive samsara? Because when you speak of body, birth, etc., you get into samsara. And do they have an opinion on the body remaining immortal? But then what is the definition? What is their definition of immortality? And why, in what circumstances do they seek divine compassion? So I will try to seek answers to these questions. And this is how I plan to proceed. So I first of all will have a look at the perception of the physical body by the Āḻvārs, so that I can move on next and see how they perceive samsara. And then, of course, we can, I mean, I'm going to say of course, but actually you don't know because I haven't spoken to you about their perceptions. Let's see what they say about the solutions to the problems related to the body and samsara, because there are a few in their points of view. And I will also give a few exceptional cases which seem to go against the general trend. So I will mostly let the Āḻvārs do the talk here, do the talking. As I bring their words straight to you, we'll see I will quote them a lot and only make comments here and there to give the talk a structure so that it has a certain logical progression. So of course, these words are my own interpretation, but they still remain the Āḻvārs' words, not necessarily my own opinions. And here I must actually thank a friend of mine, Srirangam B. Ramanujam, who knows the Nalaira Divya Prabandham, meaning the Āḻvār poetry, inside out. And he helped me choose many of the verses here because it is actually very reassuring to know that I haven't left out anything of importance in the Divya Prabandham. There are 4,000 verses after all. Anything that is of importance that is related to this topic, simply because I don't know of it. So before we proceed, here's a quick reminder on what the Āḻvārs wrote. So the Āḻvārs wrote, as I said, before the 9th century. And in the later on, Nathamuni, etc., and some of the Shivaishnava scholars gathered them together and then edited them. So they put them into 4000s Ayiram. Why am I showing you this? Because to say that the bits that you see in green, those are the ones that I'm going to focus on. Those are the works that I'm going to focus on. The second thousand, in the second thousand, you can see the Periya Tirumuri. It is by Āڵvār, and in the 4000 you can see the Tiruvaimuri, which is by Nammarva. So if you see PTM, it's Periya Tirumuri, and TVM, it's Tiruvaimuri. As you can see, the two of them have written over 1,000 verses each. I will also be quoting the other Āḻvārs, in which case I will mention their names without fail. So let's now get back to our topic and begin to look at how the Āḻvārs perceive the body. So in one of his verses, Nammarva addresses his soul the following way. The first quotation here, Unil varuire nallei po. O soul that lives in the flesh, go, you're a good one. So he establishes here the difference between the body and the soul, which lives in the body. He calls the soul nallei, meaning it is something good. What about the body then, which is left unqualified? Does the praise of the soul imply that the body isn't good? Or is the Āḻvār surprised that the soul is good despite living in a body made of flesh, which he mentions here? Well, it is a little bit ambiguous, really. But then he's not always that ambiguous. He can be pretty direct, as you can see from the next quotation. Pollavake, he says, evil body. And one of the reasons why the body is evil, at least according to the Āḻvārs, some of them, the ones that I'm quoting you here, is that the body is made of the 5 elements that the previous participant just mentioned. And then he describes, he lists those elements here. Mannai, Nir, Eri, Kal, Manjulavum Akasamum Mam, Punnar Ake. So the body abounding in source, Pun can mean sore or flesh, whichever, made of earth, water, fire, wind, and the sky where clouds wander. When he mentions the sky, it's a reference to the space here. So being made of the elements is probably what causes the body to inspire, as you will see in a minute, disgust in the Āḻvār, which leads to a pejorative characterization of the body, which is a widespread phenomenon in the Nālayara Divya Prabandham. So when I say Nālayara Divya Prabandham, it's the Āḻvār poetry. Let's have a look at another quotation. Uruvinar piraviser un podi narambu tol kurambayul pukku aruvi noi seidu nindraivartam varvadar kanjinayel, etc. So here Tirumangai Āڵvār speaks of living with the 5 senses, which constantly afflict and hurt you, having achieved a birth combined with a subtle form and entered a hovel or a body of sinews and skin that stores up flesh. We'll come back in a minute to the senses. For the moment, we can see that he uses the word kurambai for body, which of course means body nowadays, but in much of the literature, but it initially meant something like hut or hovel. So the implication is that it is a sorry place to be. It is confining. It is made of sinew, skin, and flesh. So these words seem to convey the Āḻvār's feeling. I mean, it seems that the Āڵvār feels they are gross. Probably as a consequence of being made of the 5 elements and therefore made of gross matter like skin, flesh, etc., the body fosters diseases. So that's another big problem. Here's a quotation from the Periya Tirumuri, Noyelam Pedador Ake. So a body that floods one with diseases. And then he goes on and says, Pinivalar Ake. So the body that fosters diseases. And Periyarva also very famously addressed the diseases themselves in the following way. Nei kudattai patrierum yerumbugal pol nirandu yengum kaikundu nirkindra noigal. O diseases that, like ants that climb up a pot of ghee, keep spreading and occupying all over my body, etc. So the body here is compared to a pot of ghee that attracts armies of ants that invade one's person. As a consequence, the body is a source of misery. And you saw a bit earlier on, so this is the remaining bit. So punnarake tannul pulambi talarndu eitu orinden, he says. I have declined, lamenting inside a body, abounding in sores, growing enfeebled, failing in strength. And this does not just concern the human body, but any physical body of plants, animals, you name it. As we can see from the next verse by Nammarvar. வாங்குநீர் மலர் உலகில் நிற்பனவும் திரிவனவும் ஆங்கு உயிர்கள் பிறப்பு இறப்பு பிணி மூப்பால் தகர்ப்புண்ணும் இங்கு இதன் விண்ணகரம் இவை என்ன உலகியற்கை. So the translation is, living beings, the immovable and the movable ones, are shattered due to death, disease, and old age in the world that blossoms in the water that takes them in the end. Can there be a crueler hell than this here? What is the nature of this world? So Nammarva is saddened by this world in which there is so much suffering around for himself and for the other beings, including plants and animals. We can see his compassion here for all the beings, and it hurts him to know that he cannot do much about it. It reminds one of Vallala's compassion, "Vaadiye pairai kanda bodallam vaadinen." I have wilted every time I saw a wilting sprout. And we can see that the sufferings here are caused especially, but not exclusively, due to the changing nature of the body, due to the instability of its condition, i.e., disease, old age, and death due to one's own body, and presumably by extension to the bodies of our loved ones, but in Marva's case, all the living beings. So, but then not all the problems that the body gives are caused by the change produced in the body due to disease or old age, but also due to the five senses that I mentioned earlier on, not me, the Āḻvārs. And in this case, it's a little more tricky because the Āḻvārs agree that the body can give worldly pleasure through the senses. And that's probably one reason why they shun both the pleasures and the body that is source of those pleasures. Here's a quotation from the Thiruvaimuri. கண்டு கேட்டு உற்று மோந்து உண்டு உழலும் ஐங்கருவி கண்ட இன்பம் தெரிவறிய அளவில்லா சிற்றின்பம். So he says, Urinden, there is a bit more that, yes, there is the Sitrinbam Urinden. So he says, I have been rid of endless petty pleasure derived from the five sensorial means, which whirl about seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, and eating. So Nammarva gives us the impression of chaos when he uses the word uralum, produced by the senses. But of course, he doesn't deny the fact that they do give pleasure, although they are petty. So this kind of worldly pleasure comes at a high cost, which is hidden because one doesn't perceive the cost immediately. And these pleasures are therefore treacherous, hence more dangerous than the physical ailments because they induce an illusion of well-being, of pleasure. So what is that cost? What is that danger? That is the next quotation. ஆவித்திகைக்க ஐவர் குமைக்கும் சிற்றின்பம் பலனீ காட்டி படுப்பாயோ. So here Nammarva directly addresses God here. He says, I'm quoting, will you show me many petty pleasures with the five senses, which the five senses afflict upon one, and ensnare me so that the soul is perplexed? So he is actually almost accusing God of getting him entangled in the pleasures. At least the blatantly negative elements linked with the body, like disease, old age, etc., can cause one to want to get rid of the body, which is a good thing for the Āḻvārs, as we will see later. But this kind of pleasure keeps one tied to this world, as one doesn't feel like getting rid of the body, and this forces one to take many births. According to the Āḻvārs again, I'm not saying what I think here. And this perpetuates samsara, or the cycle of births and deaths, which the Āḻvārs find unbearable, because they see samsara as a restrictive, if not dangerous space. Now, let us look at what Thirumangai thinks about the body. He thinks that the body originates in a pit. That's how he describes a womb. Thank you very much. And for him, the place seems restrictive, hence undesirable, or at least the experience of staying or passing through that pit is to the Āḻvārs. So he says, Mane nokir tamvayitru kuriyil uraikum une. So he speaks of a body fitted with flesh, which suffers in the pit that is the womb of women with deer-like eyes. So birth in such physical bodies turned the earth into prison for him. And Nammarva also speaks of, as you can see on the slide, Piraviyam Siraye, pretty prison of birth. Now, qualifying this prison as pretty can either be sarcasm, or it can show simply how birth can seem attractive and desirable, which will only drag us into further births and keep us imprisoned. And this cycle is not just compared to a prison, but also metaphorically called an ocean. As we can see from the next bit of quotation. Piravikadal Neenduvar, he says, Namarva does, who, when he refers to those who swim in the ocean of births, which is a common topos, Samsara Sagaram, which all of us know. While one birth is bad enough, souls go through many births, as one body or one birth simply in a body leads to another. So the next quotation shows Mari Mari Palapirapum Pirande. So having taken many births again and again, we almost hear Namarva's feeling of he seems to feel fed up of this repetitive process, which is unpleasant enough even when it's not repetitive. So now what causes birth, or worse, an endless series of births and deaths, according to the Āḻvārs once again? Well, many Āḻvārs mention it again and again, like Kulashekar Āḻvār here. He speaks of Sediyayaval vinegar, karma, karmas, even I would use the plural here, though it's not quite the norm, that are powerful like bushes. And the Āḻvārs also often call themselves Valvinayen, I with a powerful karma, Koduvinayen, I with a cruel karma, etc. So the body or the birth was the physical body, as well as samsara, are the results of bad karma, which itself is perpetuated by ignorance, as we can know from the next quotation, Meñyanam-inri vinayiyal pirapparundi. So sinking in births that befall one due to a karma that is devoid of true knowledge. We find here again the metaphor of the ocean with the word arundi, to sink, to drown. And then we can see from this quotation that ignorance makes either causes karma or it makes the karma worse, and seems to render escape from the situation rather difficult. But what kind of ignorance? What does he mean by ignorance? நோயெல்லாம் பெய்ததோராக்கையை மெய்யெனக் கொண்டு வாழா பேயத்தாம் பேசும் அப்பேச்சு. This is Tirumangai referring to those words vainly spoken by madmen or demoniac person, because he says payer, taking a body that gives all the diseases to be real. So Tirumangai's implication here is that one of the main types of ignorance, or even sources of ignorance, is taking the body to be the soul, confusing body and soul. And please note also the play on the word may, which means body, but also real in Tamil. So this ignorance, among other causes, among other reasons, causes one to make mistakes, like indulge in worldly pleasure, for example. This builds up karma, and karma causes more embodied births that are full of suffering, and the vicious circle feeds upon itself continuously and goes on and on. So what to do about all these problems related to the body, birth, karma, and samsara? Well, the Āḻvārs also seem to speak of the possible solutions, and that the main solution to this is association with God, which makes all these problems bearable. For example, here is the first quotation that presents a not too negative mention of the stay inside a woman's womb by Poigai Āڵvār in his Budal Tiruvandadi. கருவரங்கத்துட் கிடந்து கைதொழுதேன் கண்டேன் திருவரங்க மேயான் திசை. So looking at the direction of him who joined Sri Rangam, meaning Ranganatha, I join my hands in salutation lying inside the womb. So here the womb is simply, he says, Karuvarangam. So Arangam can mean a stage or it can simply mean a place. So it's not pejorative. And then he also points out here that he was a devotee ever since before his birth, when he was lying in his mother's womb. And then Namarva suggests also that one should put their body and youth to good use before it's too late. And that is the next quotation here. கிழறொளி இளமை கெடுவதன் முன்னம் வளரொளி மாயோன் மருவிய கோயில் வளரிளம் பொழில் சூழ் மாலிரும் சோலை தளர்விலராகில் சார்வது சதிரே. The translation of which is, before youth with a brilliant shine wears out, it would be clever to approach, being free from faintness, Malirunchole, surrounded by thriving young groves, the temple that the dark one with growing splendor has joined. So the body can have good functions too, like taking you to the temple, if you put it to good use. And then Periyarva suggests also that diseases cannot approach a body under certain circumstances. It's not using all the remedies that we mentioned earlier on, etc., the potions or whatever. Let's have a look at what he says. Again, not my opinion, it is Periyarvas. நெய்க்குடத்தை பற்றி ஏறும் எறும்புகள் போல் நிறைந்து எங்கும் கைக்கொண்டு நிற்கின்ற நோய்கள் காலம் பெற உய்யப்போமின் மெய்கொண்டு வந்து புகுந்த வேத பிரானார் கிடந்தார் பைக்கொண்ட பாம்பனையோடும் பண்டன்று பட்டினம் காப்பே. So we saw a bit at the beginning. So here's the continuation. O diseases, which like ants that climb up a pot of ghee, keep spreading and occupying all over my body, go save yourselves quickly. The Vedic Lord, or the Lord of the Vedas, has come and entered my body and lay there along with his serpent bed. It is not like in the old times. His protection is upon the city. So Periyarva here points out that once God enters his body, it becomes his abode, his city, so that the diseases have no place there. He repeats in this very same decade that one's body also becomes God's temple when one becomes devoted to him. So he says, Singa Piranavan Yemman Serum Tirukoyil Kandir. Look, it is the sacred temple joined by our master Narasimha. So here's a very positive impression that he gives on the body. And then he also says, Pitrangal Meikum Piranar Penum Tirukoyil Kandir. Look, it is the sacred temple cherished by the honorable Lord who grazes cattle, i.e. Krishna. So the means to check the various issues caused by the body, like diseases, etc., is to obtain God's compassion. Let God have contact with our body. And the same goes not just with the diseases, and the same goes with bad karma, apparently. So this is what Nammarva says in his Thiruviruttam. Yeppodum kaikarala nemiyan nammel vinay kadivan. So he whose disgust never leaves his hand in order to destroy the karma that is upon us. So Narayana, for him, Narayana is God, holds his disgust in order to destroy the karma with the powerful Sudarshana. And Periyarva follows suit when he says, Mangiya valvinai noigal, umakum or valvinai kandir, ingu puhenmin elidandru kandir puhenmin. So, all diseases caused by powerful karma that obscures the soul, look, here's a bad thing that has occurred to you. Do not enter here, do not enter. Look, it is not easy, do not enter. So here, God hinders bad karma itself, which is bad news, which is bad karma actually for the diseases themselves. Not just that, God and his compassion are clearly the solution for all the problems, according to Nammarva in one of the verses. He changes his mind quite often depending on the mood that he is in. So here's what he says here. Oyu mu pirappu pini viyu maru seivan thiruvengadatayan. So he almost reuses the same wordings as in other verses. So the cowherd, meaning Krishna, the cowherd from the sacred Venkatam, will make weakening old age, birth, death, and disease cease. So Periyarva gets actually into more detail than Nammarva does as to what the compassionate God does to solve all the problems which we mentioned earlier on. I'm just repeating a part of the quotation here. Vayittril thoruvai pirittu vanpula sevai yadakki கயிற்றும் காணி கழித்து காலிடை பாசம் கழற்றி எயிற்றிடை மண் கொண்ட எந்தை இராப்பகல் ஓதுவித்து என்னை பயிற்றி பணி செய்ய கொண்டான் பண்டன்று பட்டினம் காப்பேன். The translation of which is, separating me from the womb prison, subduing the powerful bulls that are the senses, eliminating the sinew cords, bones, and desire in the body, removing Yama's noose from around the feet, Father who held the earth on his tusks, meaning Varaha, instructs and teaches me day and night and took me to serve him. It is not like in the old times. His protection is upon the city. So God stops birth, he subdues the senses, he eliminates the body, and yet doesn't allow us to get caught by Yama by taking us as his devotee. So while pointing out that God can cut down our troubles, Periyarva also clearly insinuates that the greatest favor he can do is to stop the karma by eliminating our desire in the body and possibly the body itself, thus preventing further births. And this is repeatedly and more clearly and blatantly mentioned by Nammarva, because getting rid of the body is a running theme throughout Nammarva's work, especially the Thiruvaimuri. Because What caused the problem needs to be rooted out. That's how you can solve the problem, according to him. And merely making the body disease-free or life problem-free is not the aim per se of the Āḻvārs, but to get to the root of the problem. So the Āḻvārs want to get rid of their bodies to put a full stop to births, karma, and samsara, etc. So in this verse, actually it is a Phalasruti of the Thiruvaimozhi 3:2. And Phalasruti, as you know, is the listening to the fruit, which actually means it is a verse in which a poet tells the reader or the reciter or the listener simply what benefits the person will draw from reading, reciting, etc., a particular set of verses. So here's what Nammarva says. உயிர்கள் எல்லா உலகமும் உடையவனை குயில்கொள் சோலை தென்குருகூர் சடகோபன் செய்யரில் சொல் இசைமாலை ஆயிரத்துள் இப்பத்தும் உயிரின் மேல் ஆக்கை ஊனிடை ஒழிவிக்குமே. So he says, this decade, among the 1,000 verses of the music garland with blemishless words by Sadagopan from Kurugur in the south, that's Nammarva's name, so Kurugur, how is Kurugur? With groves, with coils, on him who possesses all the words and living beings. So what does this decade do? It rids one of their bodies made of flesh, which hang upon the soul. Usually we expect that the recitation of verses, devotional verses especially, will bring us wealth or health or education. But here, Nammarva sweetly promises the end of the body, i.e. death, to the reciter. On another occasion, he is more blunt when he desires death for himself. He says here, நன்னாதார் முறுவலிப்ப நல்லுற்றார் கரைந்து ஏங்க எண்ணாரா துயிர் விளைக்கும் இவை என்ன உலகியற்கை கண்ணாளா கடல் கடைந்தாய் உனக்கழற்கே வரும் பரிசு தன்னாவாது அடியேனை பணி கண்டாய் சாமாரே. So this means, what is the nature of this world which causes unthinkable sorrow so that the foes smile and the good can lament and pine? O protector, O you who churn the ocean, bless me, a slave, so that I die with the means to reach your ankleted feet, not being delayed. So we can see here that a wish for death coincides with a wish to reach God's feet, and God's feet actually are the liberation that the Āḻvārs seeks. And liberation along with the body is not an option suggested by the Āḻvār, at least not by Nammarva. So the death of the body brings liberation from worldly sorrow, not systematically though, but it happens only with God's compassion, because otherwise, without God's compassion, death of the body brings simply another birth. And please note that here too, God is referred to as Kadal Kadaindai, or you who churned the ocean, which alludes to the ocean of Samsara also. So if Narayana could churn the milk ocean, then surely he can do something about the ocean of Samsara and help and salvage the Āḻvār. So we can see a prominent role of God's compassion in this work pertaining to this, the themes of the body, the troubles of the body, mortality, etc. So it is God's compassion is so important for liberation and pain, liberation from pain and sorrow, that the Āḻvārs constantly appeal to him, as we can see here. So this is the Thiruvaimozhi. நோயே மூப்பு இறப்பிறப்பு பிணையே என்றிவை ஒழிய கூயேக்குள் அடியேனை கொடு உலகம் காட்டேலே. Call me a slave to yourself so that these, i.e., pain, old age, birth, death, and disease cease. Do not show me this cruel world. Elsewhere, Nammarva also, actually, he goes to the extent of encouraging people to look forward to, with happiness even, contemplate the day when they will be rid of the body. That's the next quotation here. ஒடுங்க அவன் கண் ஒடுங்கலும் எல்லாம் விடும் பின்னும் ஆக்கை விடும் பொழுது எண்ணே. As you submit to him, all obstacles will leave. Thereafter, think of the day you give up the body. So that's bliss for him, apparently. That precedes the real big bliss, which is liberation, i.e. Vaikuntha for him. As a matter of fact, there is a whole decade in which Nammarva imagines his soul's progress to Vaikuntha. That is Thiruvaimozhi 10:9. And then he describes what his soul encounters in the path, how it is welcomed, etc., and how it reaches Vaikuntha. By the way, Vaikuntha is not just a state; it is a place for the Āḻvārs, which corresponds to liberation. And actually, we can see then that he does exactly what he preaches. Namely, he contemplates on the day he will shed his body and hopefully go to Vaikuntha. So sometimes the urge to leave this world grows so much in Namarva that he presses forth, forgetting God's immediate act of compassion. This is what we see from the next quotation. Avi tihaika aivarkumaikum sitchinbam paviyenei palani katti padupayo, which I have already read out to you before. Tavi vayam kunda tadantamarai gatke kuvikollum kalam innam kurugado. So he kuvi etc. is something that he repeats. Will you show me a sinner many petty pleasures with the five senses, which the five senses afflict, and ensnare me so that the soul is perplexed? Will the time to call me to your lotus feet that stretched out and took the earth, meaning as Vamana, not be reduced further? So Namarva does not want a long life, let alone a permanent one in his body. He wants to leave this world, and that to immediately get liberation and go to God, thanks to God's compassion. For God is the cause for liberation, as he points out very, very clearly. Veedu mudalam punaivan piravikadal neenduvarke. So he is the cause of moksha. He is the ship for those who swim in the ocean of births. And then he repeats it again in the following verse. Neendum tuyar piravi utpada machevvavayum, Neendum tuyarella vidu mudal. So it's the cause for moksha, meaning liberation, which is free from any distress of swimming across, including the distressful births across which one swims. Now, having said, so much about how the body is awful, etc., plenty of negative things about the body and birth, and the desirability of liberation, I must point out that the Āḻvārs sometimes also give an alternative opinion here and there on certain conditions, and usually that is association with God, again, unsurprisingly. So if the body allows the Āḻvārs to get close to God, then even birth is desirable for them, even if it is, in a place on the earth. They do not just accept having a body, but very eagerly ask for another birth in another human body, or even animal or plant body, or even they don't mind being an inanimate being. And I will take the example of Kulashekara Āḻvār's Perumal Tirumuri, the 4th decade, in which he expresses his wish to be born again, not as a random person, but as a devotee, and as I will show you, as various living beings and non-living beings on the Venkatam hills. Excuse me. Okay, here's what he says. Mooneru selvattu udatpiravi yaan vendeen, aanerel vendran adimai tiramallal, kooneru sangamidattan tan vengadattu, koneri vaazhum kuruhai pirappene. I will not desire birth in a body, the wealth of which consists in having flesh that builds up, but the state of servitude for him who subdued the 7 bulls. I shall be born as a heron living in the Koneri lake in Venkatam, of him who has a conch that is curved to the left. So he continues in the same vein in the rest of the decade. As you can see from the slide, I'm not going to read everything. He says, Meenai pirakkum vidiyudayena venesi. He says, I would like to be a fish in Venkatam. And then Venkadathu senbagamai nirkum tiruvudayena vene. I would like to be a champaka tree or a champaka flower in Venkata. And then he says, Iril Venkada male mel tambahamai nirkum tavamudayena vene. So he says he would like to be a tambakam. Tambakam actually is like a post. So we are getting into an inanimate, lifeless thing here. And then he says, Kanarai payum karutudayena vene. He wants to be a forest river in Venkatam. And then he says, Padiyai kidandun pavalavai kanbene. So he wants to be a step at the entrance of the temple in Venkatam, Tirumala, in order to contemplate upon God. And then he says, Venkadam, Tiruvengadam ennum yemperuman punmale mel yedenum mavene. I'll become anything in the Venkatam of the Lord. So he is very ready to give up this body and get another body, even if it is an inferior one. In such cases, even liberation, meaning Vaikuntha, is not quite so attractive. Let's see what Tondaradipudi Āḻvār says. He says, Pachema male pol meni, pavalavai kamala chingan, achuta amararere, ayartam kurunde yennum, ichuvai tavirayan poi indiralohamalum, achuvai perinum venden arangamanagarulane. So he says, other than the state obtained from saying, O Achyuta, with a body like a big green mountain, coral lips and red lotus eyes, O bull among the immortals, O scion of the cowherds, Even if I were to get that taste derived from going and ruling over Indra's world or the world of God, I would not want it. Or you who are in the big city of Rangam. So Indra Logam can be simply said Indra's world or heaven, or you can go back to the etymological root of Indra, which means God simply. So God's world, some commentators have interpreted this as Vaikuntha actually. Whichever way, he says he rejects Vaikuntha, he rejects heaven. He says, I'd rather be in Sri Rangam, praise God's name. So, in conclusion, I would like to say that on the whole, the Āḻvārs seem to dislike having a body and associate the body with all sorts of ill, physical and metaphysical, as it helps perpetuate the cycle of births and deaths, so that the suffering is perpetual. Their way of overcoming this is to achieve liberation, which frees their immortal souls from mortal bodies and gives them unending bliss in an immortal world by reaching God. And for this, they want to be rid of their bodies, for liberation implies the losing of the body. Now, the Sri Vaishnava Acharyas of the second millennium believe that Nammarva wanted liberation when he started composing his Tiruvaimuri, the first verses of the Tiruvaimuri. But Narayana made him stay on earth so that he could compose more verses for the good of the world. And when Nammarva was finished and he could not stand anymore, he really absolutely wanted to shed his mortal coils and reach Vaikuntha. God really wanted to take Nammarva along with his gross material body, because it was that body that produced those verses. So it's something very cherished by Narayana. But the Āḻvā insisted on leaving behind his body, so much he disliked it, so that God actually respected his wish. And this is something that is enacted even today during the Vaikuntha Ekadasi festivals, I suppose in many many temples, but it is done in a very special way in Sri Rangam, for example. As you can see, we can see Nammarva prostrating at the feet of God here, and this festival is known as Nammarva Moksham. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. I would like to compliment you on your speech. It was very insightful and is quite relevant to our discussion today. Gives us a different perspective on the Āḻvārs, and it helps us relate to what Vallala's teachings or